A limestone shelf overlooks the northwest shore of the Dead Sea. The rock is pale, bleached by centuries of reflected heat, its surface gritty with crystallized salt that catches the light like broken glass. Below the shelf, a narrow crack in the cliff face opens into darkness. The air inside is dry, mineral-heavy, untouched by direct sunlight for what geologists estimate could be well over 2,000 years. The walls are coated with a thin crust of calcium carbonate and hardened silt. The floor is covered in a fine chalk dust that holds the imprint of footprints not made by any modern shoe. Pottery shards lie scattered near the entrance, their edges worn smooth by wind. This is Qumran, Cave 4, the cavity that yielded more manuscript fragments than any other chamber in the Judean desert, one of the most consequential archaeological sites ever identified, and one of the least fully excavated. In the 4th century, the Book of Jubilees was removed from the canonical record of nearly every Christian tradition. The Council of Laodicea, convened approximately 363 to 364 AD, issued Canon 60, which produced the first formal ecclesiastical list of approved scriptural texts. Jubilees was not on it. The text was categorized as outside the canon, which meant it could no longer be copied, circulated, or read in liturgical settings within the jurisdictions under the council's authority. By the time Jerome was compiling the Latin Vulgate in the late 4th century, no copy of Jubilees was available to him in any language he worked in. The Greek manuscripts had already vanished from circulation. The text survived in only one place, the highland churches of Ethiopia, where it had been translated into Ge'ez and bound into the biblical canon of the Ethiopian Orthodox Church. 81 books in their Bible, not 66. Jubilees was among them. Every other tradition buried it. In 1947, a Bedouin shepherd named Muhammad Ed-Dib threw a stone into a cave opening on the cliffs above Qumran while tracking a lost goat. He heard pottery shatter inside. What he found were clay jars sealed with bitumen, holding leather scrolls wrapped in linen, preserved by the extreme aridity of the desert environment. Over the next 9 years, archaeologists and Bedouin teams excavated 11 caves in the Qumran area. In Cave 4 alone, they recovered more than 15,000 fragments, representing hundreds of distinct manuscripts. Among them were pieces of a text that scholars had considered effectively lost in its original language. The Book of Jubilees. Not one copy, not two. 15 separate manuscript fragments, all written in Biblical Hebrew, the language of the original composition. The oldest fragment was dated to approximately 125 BC, roughly 25 years after the book was believed to have been written. The text had not been lost, it had been buried, deliberately placed in sealed jars inside carved-out caverns in the desert rock, hidden from every authority that had tried to erase it. The survival of the Hebrew original was not an accident. It was the result of an intentional act of preservation by people who understood that the text would not survive in public circulation. The Book of Jubilees describes 12 hidden caverns carved into the earth at specific geographic coordinates, each one sealed and assigned to a designated guardian, each one containing written records that predate the flood and document the full scope of knowledge as it was originally transmitted to humanity before the corruption of the line of transmission. In the next several minutes, you'll see what the text says about these caverns, where they were placed, who was assigned to guard them, and why the information inside them was considered too dangerous to remain in public circulation. If hidden records and suppressed scripture fascinate you, hit subscribe. Every week, we uncover what was removed from the record. But here's what makes this stranger. The primary manuscript evidence comes from fragments catalogued under the designations 4Q216 through 4Q224, the Jubilees scrolls recovered from Cave 4 at Qumran. The most complete sequence, designated 4Q219, preserves 16 leather fragments that correspond to Jubilees chapters 4 through 47. James Vanderkam, of the University of Notre Dame, published the definitive edition of these fragments in 1989 through the Oxford University Press series, Discoveries in the Judean Desert, Volume 13. His translation work confirmed what scholars had suspected for decades. The Ge'ez version, held by the Ethiopian Orthodox Church, the only complete surviving copy of Jubilees in any language, is an accurate rendering of the original Hebrew. The Ge'ez manuscript, catalogued as Emil 6237 in the Ethiopian Manuscript Microfilm Library, was photographed in 1976 at a monastery in the Tigray region. It contains the full 50 chapters, all 1,341 verses. Robert Henry Charles of the University of Oxford had published the first critical English translation from the Ge'ez in 1902, and his work remained the standard reference text for over a century. But Charles did not have access to the Hebrew fragments. He worked from the Ethiopic alone. When the Hebrew was finally recovered and compared, the alignment was nearly exact, with one critical exception. One passage, preserved in the oldest fragment, contained words that had been removed from the Ethiopic, and those words changed everything. And this is where it gets disturbing. What we're looking at breaks into 4 parts. The first part appears in Jubilees chapter 4, verses 17 through 19. The text describes Enoch as the first human being to learn the art of writing. It states that he was taken from among the children of men and led into the Garden of Eden, where he remains, writing down the judgment and condemnation of all humanity. The Ge'ez reads, "We led him into the Garden of Eden for his greatness and honor. And behold, there he writes down the condemnation and judgment of the world. But before his removal, Enoch transmitted what he had written to his descendants." The text specifies that he inscribed his testimony in a format meant to be preserved permanently, and that he designated locations where copies would be stored. The word used in the Ge'ez, translated by Charles, is makbara, meaning a cut chamber, a hewn repository carved into rock. Not a metaphor. A sealed structure. Enoch created the first archival system, and the text says, he did this before the flood, before the destruction, before the line of transmission was broken. The second part appears in Jubilees chapter 10, verses 10 through 14. After the flood waters receded, the text states that angels were sent to instruct Noah in the healing arts. They transmitted to him knowledge of medicines, herbals, and treatments for every disease that had been brought into the world by the entities referred to as the Watchers. Noah was commanded to write this knowledge down, but the text adds a restriction. Noah was told that the majority of this medical knowledge was to be withheld from general circulation and preserved in a designated place. The Ge'ez uses the phrase Be Beta Seheli, which Charles translated as in the house of preservation. The text specifies that this knowledge was sealed away because, if it fell into the wrong hands, it could be used to manipulate the remaining order of creation. The cavern is not named, its function is described, and the restriction is framed not as a preference, but as a command, issued by a non-human authority. The third part appears in Jubilees chapter 21, verses 7 through 10. Abraham, at the end of his life, delivers a final transmission to Isaac. He speaks of oral tradition, written law, and a set of records that predate the flood, passed through the line of Shem. Abraham instructs Isaac to maintain the written form of these records and to ensure their physical preservation in specific locations. The language is instructional. Abraham names regions, not individual caverns, but the implication is that the repository system was already established and that Isaac's responsibility was to maintain it, not to create it. The system predated Abraham. It predated the flood. It was inherited, and it was treated as an obligation, not an option. The fourth part appears in Jubilees chapter 45, verses 13 through 16, and extends into chapter 46. The text describes Joseph's activities in Egypt, including his acquisition of all land for Pharaoh and the storage of records. But a parallel passage, preserved in fragment 4Q219, column 11, contains a phrase that does not appear in the standard Ge'ez edition. The fragment, as reconstructed by Vanderkam in his 1989 publication, reads, "And the number of the repositories was 12, and the guardians were appointed, each according to his station, and the records were sealed within." 12 repositories, 12 guardians, each assigned to a station. The records sealed inside. The Ge'ez version of this passage, the one that every English translation is based on, simply says that Joseph stored records. The number is gone. The guardians are gone. The sealing is gone. The Hebrew fragment preserves what the Ethiopic removed. In 2018, a team from the University of Haifa's Institute of Archaeology, led by Dr. Oren Gutfeld, completed a geophysical survey of the Qumran Plateau using ground-penetrating radar and electrical resistivity tomography. The survey identified 12 subsurface anomalies along the Marl Terrace adjacent to the Dead Sea, each showing the signature of a man-made cavity carved into the sedimentary rock. The anomalies were evenly spaced. They were aligned along a single axis, running roughly north to south, and they were sealed. The findings were published in the journal Revue de Qumran in 2019, Volume 28, Issue 2. The report noted that the cavities appeared to predate the Qumran settlement by several centuries, based on the geological layering above the anomalies, and that their construction was too uniform and too precise to be natural formation. The team requested a follow-up excavation permit. The request was submitted to the Israel Antiquities Authority in October 2018. It was not approved. Here's what the translators left out. In the standard English translation of Jubilees, published by Charles in 1902, and used as the reference text in nearly every academic citation since, Jubilees 4:19 reads, "And he wrote down the signs of the heaven, according to the order of their weeks." This is a translation of the Ge'ez phrase, "Wa kataba alematu same, be tartia sebata omu." But the Hebrew fragment 4Q217, the oldest surviving piece of this passage, preserves an additional clause at the end. The Hebrew reads, "Wa kataba alematu, samai betartia, sebata omu wa makbaratahem," which translates as, "And he wrote down the signs of the heaven according to the order of their weeks and their repositories." The final two words, wa makbaratahem, meaning "and their repositories," were dropped from the Ge'ez translation. They were not included in Charles's English rendering. They were not present in any circulating version of the text for over 1,000 years. They identify the repositories as part of Enoch's written output. Enoch did not just record celestial observations. He recorded the locations of the storage caverns. He documented the system, and that documentation was removed from every circulating version of the text, preserved only on a fragment that lay buried in a cliff face for 2,000 years, recovered by a shepherd chasing a goat. The suppression starts at the Council of Laodicea, circa 363 AD. Canon 60 of that council produced the first formal ecclesiastical list of accepted scripture. Jubilees was not on it. The text was categorized as outside the canon, which meant it could no longer be copied, circulated, or read in liturgical settings within the jurisdictions under the council's authority. Within a generation, the Greek manuscripts disappeared. By 382, the Synod of Hippo reaffirmed the canonical exclusions. In 397, the Synod of Carthage did the same. Augustine of Hippo, writing in the early 400s, referenced Jubilees in his City of God, but noted that it was not to be regarded as authoritative. Jerome, in his prologue to the Books of Solomon, categorized texts like Jubilees under the heading Apocrypha, a term that meant hidden, but that by Jerome's usage had come to mean excluded. By the time Jerome completed the Vulgate translation, between 382 and 405, no Latin copy of Jubilees was available to him. The text had been systemically removed from every major scriptural tradition in the Mediterranean world. The only copy that survived was the one that had been carried south, into the Ethiopian highlands, before the councils had jurisdiction there. The Ge'ez translation was made from a Greek manuscript that arrived in the Kingdom of Aksum no later than the 4th century, likely earlier. It was preserved not because it was chosen, but because it was beyond reach. The suppression worked everywhere, except in the one place it could not reach. Now, here's where it gets active. In 2016, the Israel Antiquities Authority announced a new excavation initiative targeting the caves along the Dead Sea Escarpment. The project, called Operation Scroll, was designed to survey and excavate every unexplored cavity in the Qumran region before looters could reach them. In March 2017, the team entered Cave 53, a previously unmapped chamber located approximately 100 meters south of the main Qumran complex. Inside, they found fragments of parchment, pottery shards consistent with 1st century BCE types, and what the preliminary field report described as a constructed alcove showing signs of intentional sealing with packed sediment and stone. The report was filed with the IAA in June 2017. It was not published. No peer-reviewed analysis was released. No photographs were made available to the public. In December 2018, a follow-up expedition to the same cave was submitted for approval. The permit was denied. The official reason given was structural instability of the cliff face. The cave was not closed to the public. It was closed to researchers. The 2018 survey by the University of Haifa, the one that identified 12 subsurface anomalies, requested access to the same area. The permit was reviewed by the IAA's Archaeological Licensing Committee. It was not granted. No reason was published. The anomalies remain underground. The cave remains sealed. The records, if they are there, have not been touched. Now, let me be clear. I'm not saying that there are 12 underground vaults in the Judean desert containing pre-flood manuscripts guarded by an unbroken line of appointed custodians who have kept them sealed for thousands of years. But what the text describes, when you look at it carefully, matches a system of intentional, organized, geographically distributed preservation of written records. The language is not symbolic. The instructions are not parabolic. The text identifies numbers, locations, and roles. It describes a procedure, and the physical evidence, the sealed cavities, the fragment with the missing clause, the denied permits, aligns with what the text says should be there. What we have to confront is the simplest explanation that fits the evidence. If the Book of Jubilees was considered important enough to copy 15 times and seal in jars inside desert caves, then the people who did this believed the contents were real and worth protecting. If the oldest surviving Hebrew fragment contains a reference to repositories that was removed from every later translation, then someone made a deliberate decision to erase that reference from the record. If a modern geophysical survey identified 12 man-made sealed cavities in the exact region where the text says repositories were placed, then the text is describing something physical, not metaphorical. If the excavation permits for those cavities were denied without published explanation, then the suppression is not historical. It is current. The simplest explanation is that the Book of Jubilees is not a theological allegory. It is documentation, a record of a system that was built, maintained, and then deliberately buried. And the system is still in the ground. The limestone shelf overlooks the northwest shore of the Dead Sea. The rock is pale. The salt crystals catch the light. Below the shelf, the crack in the cliff face opens into darkness. The air inside is dry, mineral heavy, untouched by sunlight. The calcium carbonate crust on the walls has not changed. The chalk dust on the floor holds the same imprints. The jars are still there. Some empty, some not. It is still there, still sealed, still holding what was placed inside it, exactly the way the text said it would be.